Hey guys, and welcome to my new series, Yesterday I Read, where I tell you about a book I read yesterday. The reason I decided to make this series is because I read a lot, and sometimes I feel like I don't put that much into this channel, and I want to put more into this channel because I genuinely love you all from the bottom of my heart. So, I decided I'd just take that 7 hours each day I spend reading and would lift it into this channel in the form of these reviews. Now, because I read for 7 hours, that means sometimes I will read less than a whole book in one day, sometimes more than the whole book. If I'm like one chapter away from finishing a book and I've already spent my allotted 7 hours, then I may push for another hour that day, but otherwise I'll just finish it the next morning and upload the video then. That's why this is called Yesterday I Read rather than Today I Read. But yesterday I did cheat a bit because I got back from St. Albans at gone midday, so I ended up reading a book that was about 75 pages, but they were A4 pages, so it was basically a glorified journal article called Why Internet Porn Matters by Margret Grebowicz, and I hope I'm pronouncing that right. I looked up how to pronounce the spelling and I got the impression it's like the Russian ts in tsar, but it's ch instead of a s, so it's ch. I don't know. I like to try to pronounce things properly, so if anyone wants to give me a better idea of how to pronounce Grebowicz, then let me know. This book is one of those books that spends a lot of time summarizing other people's positions and then evaluating their arguments, rather than putting forward that many arguments in its own right, but I'm going to try and make sure I'm broadly representing the evaluation rather than just attributing other people's arguments to Grebowicz. Something Grebowicz does early on is concede that the psychology of porn is important. It matters what's going on in someone's mind when someone watches porn. However, her intention in this book is to work from philosophical intuition, basically. The problem with me and feminist philosophy is that I don't really have enough grounding in philosophy in general. So I think I can pick up some of the stuff being communicated, but even when I get a rough idea of what's being communicated, I can struggle to formulate that back as an argument. She says also that she's dealing with a more existential idea of what pornography is, rather than looking at the effects of pornography. She brings up a contradiction of sorts in terms of how we can interpret the pervasiveness of pornography. Because we live in a very pornified society where so much media is pornographic, comedy will treat watching porn as just a given premise for observational comedy. And one of the effects this has is that it makes pornography more human and relatable because it's no longer a seedy thing. However, maybe the way it infects every facet of culture is actually something worth criticising. And maybe we think that pornography is fine because we're so used to it just being presented as a fact and not questioned as a norm. But actually, it's this very dimension to porn that is a testament to how problematic it can be. When you've got sexualized images of women in submission in advertisements, for example. She says it's quite difficult to define porn, and she acknowledges the general anti-porn claim that any attempt to define porn is simply identifying what we can already identify. Everybody already knows what porn is, so coming up with an official definition is just to save a bit of academic aggro. And Grebowicz attempts a definition by defining porn as any media designed to aid masturbation. Now, this definition is a bit weird in some sense because it kind of just shifts the intuition from an intuitive definition of porn to an intuitive understanding of intent. Because she admits that lots of things that aren't porn can be masturbated to, but she just says they're not designed to be masturbated to. This got me thinking about Game of Thrones because I sometimes see sex scenes from Game of Thrones that end up on Pornhub, and I'm inclined to say that the act of taking those sex scenes and putting them on Pornhub is pornography, even though the scenes themselves in their original context are not porn. Having said that, even though I don't imagine HBO thinks people are going to have a 30-second wank for the duration of a Game of Thrones sex scene in between enjoying the high fantasy drama, it's obviously gratuitous sex. And I do think the element of gratuity is useful for defining pornographic content. So even though Game of Thrones sex scenes aren't sex for the sake of masturbation, they certainly are, I think, sex for the sake of sex. She moves on to the whole free speech debate, and anyone who is familiar with the feminist sex wars will be familiar with the argument that porn isn't really free speech, because porn is basically sex. That's the message of porn, sex and sexual gratification. But the people producing porn aren't really saying that, they're just documenting actual physical sex occurring. This is contrasted with erotica and pornography of the days of yore, when people wrote pornographic novels, where the principal producer is producing the sex by manipulating ideas and conceptions in our imaginations. But modern pornography isn't speech in the same sense. Now, this whole debate was born out of the issues with the First Amendment when feminists were trying to restrict pornography and wanted to show they weren't silencing anyone's speech. Pornographers can say whatever they want, but paying women to have sex isn't speech. That was broadly the argument. Of course, the First Amendment is irrelevant to me anyway. And then you get this quote. Insofar as much mainstream pornography overtly depicts subordination and dominance, the material practice of pornography allows the body to experience intense pleasure at these social relations. The problem is not that pornography somehow magically, automatically grants men power over women, or even, Parche, McKinnon, and Dworkin, that the men in pornography exercise real power over the women with whom they have sex, but that men consuming pornography experience physical pleasure at the sights and sounds of the subordination of women. And of course, this is saying what I've basically said in this channel before. It's the knockdown argument against porn as far as I'm concerned. No matter how you slice it, most mainstream porn, which Grebowicz refers to as hardcore heterosexual porn, is men getting off to the subordination of women. And a lot of feminists argue that porn is fantasy and therefore not a problem. And Grebowicz basically says, why not? And then later on in the book, somebody else says pornography is like science fiction. There's this theme in pro-porn feminism of trying desperately to describe pornography as something other than what it is. And in this case, it's compared to science fiction because science fiction is about pushing new boundaries, which is what porn does somehow. The thing is, if science fiction or fantasy said about women what porn says about women, it would be loathed. Imagine if Star Trek presented women the way porn presented women. You want to talk about misogyny in geek culture? Fine. But if you start trying to rationalize porn, then what can't be done to women in fantasy? And I read through multiple times thinking maybe I've misread, but she says, if you want the exact quote, one model for looking at pornography would be as a kind of science fiction, that is, a fantasy about future, whose setting is the present. We don't get offended when science fiction imagines different futures, even dystopic ones set in worlds that look like our own. That's by the theorist Kipnis, who is quite prominent in pro-porn feminism. But yeah, she's basically making the argument that porn depicts bad things done to women and bad attitudes to women, but it should be taken the same way we'd interpret a dystopian future in sci-fi. She's basically comparing Terminator, showing robots killing humans, to porn, showing men spitting on and choking and verbally abusing women. If somebody wants to type in the comments, oh yeah, I find that argument convincing, I will actually try to get across to them why a dystopian future set up as the fate our protagonists want to prevent, and the entire stakes for the film, is different from the subordination of women that is supposed to be arousing in its own right. The other big pro-porn feminist alongside Kipnis is Strawson, author of the book Defending Pornography. That's the title of the book. Who first of all makes the shitty slippery slope argument, if you ban porn, then why not ban other stuff, which doesn't make any sense. Slippery slope is literally a fallacy. I'm going to do a video on free speech soon where I address this in more detail, but it isn't a good argument. And then in addition to this, she makes a psychoanalytic argument, which I fucking hate. Any argument that just resorts to discussing the mentality of why someone disagrees with you is generally shit. It's okay when you have very clearly laid out your position. A good example of psychoanalyzing the ideological opposition is this channel that has a series of videos about a hypothetical anti-feminist called Angry Jack, which I will post in the description. Firstly, it's a very good argument, and secondly, it's backed up by a whole load of actual academic arguments. But Strawson basically jumps right in with the claim that the only reason anyone ever supports censorship of anything, including porn, is because they're old and they don't understand it and they want to control their children. She basically says that censorship never has any ideological motivation, only an emotional motivation. Something that isn't really to do with pornography, but I just found interesting, was an argument that censorship is not just stopping people expressing their internal thoughts, but sometimes refers to stopping people formulating certain internal thoughts. And that argument can be used to defend all sorts of positions. There is something broadly discussed here about how pornography silences women, at least indirectly, because it encourages misogynistic attitudes, which then undermine women and make women less likely to engage in academia and be less forceful with their opinions, ipso facto silence women. Something the book begins to talk about is the idea that people seem to really want to share their intimate details, and it sort of talks about how we didn't really know how much people want to share until they had the opportunity, which is kind of an interesting thought. Nowadays, everyone my age wants to make some quite intimate details about themselves known, and obviously people like me produce all this content because we have brains filled with nuggets of wisdom that we need to pour out onto YouTube. And this is connected to porn with the logic that, first of all, sex is a hugely intimate thing that people want to talk about. Even I, an anti-porn advocate, have laced my anti-porn arguments with details about my own sexual history. And then you have Pornhub with videos getting likes and views and comments, and it's a lot like YouTube. And nowadays we can see what people like, and there is a sense of community with the feedback from porn. Now, to me, the first thing I notice about this is how much it exposes the naivety of female-friendly porn. In the 70s and 80s, when this stuff was maybe not as immediately accessible and there wasn't so much big data, someone could be forgiven for being so naive as to think that female-friendly porn could reform porn from the inside. But nowadays, you have no excuse. You can go onto Pornhub. You can see how people are responding to tight anal whores get smashed compared to the veritable snooze fest that is female-friendly porn. People don't care. People aren't going to care. You can tell me about how I'm censoring people's free speech, but at least I'm listening to what they're saying before I advocate censorship, compared to you, who puts your fingers in your ear and convinces yourself that really porn is basically a good thing. And I'm sure after men get tired of watching a woman be slapped around by a room full of guys, they'll all flock to your feminist, female-friendly porn. And the whole get more women in porn thing is classical liberal feminism. It's the we need more gender equality in concentration camps argument. It's let's have gender equal patriarchy. Come on, you big mean sexists. Let the woman have a turn oppressing women. It's not just a man's game. And there's the whole argument about how porn breaks boundaries by showing women enjoying sex. Okay, yeah, there is some porn that shows women enjoying sex, and a fraction of that porn shows women enjoying sex that women actually enjoy. But why does women enjoying sex have to win the approval of the male gaze in the form of porn? Why not encourage the idea that you can only have sex with people who want to have sex? Not people who want to make money, people who want to have sex. So, got to get rid of sex work before we can seriously have that conversation. Why don't we start with that presumption, and then once liberal feminists stop coddling male sexuality by guaranteeing them all the exploited women they want in the virtual world, we can have a conversation about what women actually want from sex. The book talks about using porn as sex education, and basically concludes that you can't really educate about sex by just showing and describing sex. Sex has moral dimensions. One other thing that's mentioned is that male pleasure is more obvious in porn, as demonstrated quite literally by the cum shot, whereas female pleasure is easily faked. It's also worth noting the male orgasm is always the climax of porn, at least porn between only a few individuals. Obviously, bukkake's different. I also saw an expression of an age-old argument, but worse. This pro-porn guy basically says that in fascist countries, people aren't allowed to do things. And if we banned porn, that would be something people weren't allowed to do. Therefore, banning porn is fascist. He basically says democracy can only really exist when there's no censorship, which would be true if we were talking about information that pertains to policy. But that's not what any feminist is concerned about. Feminists are mostly concerned about things that shouldn't even be up for debate in a democracy, like the basic equal dignity of every human being. There's a mention of a classic McKinnon argument that privacy is not a feminist goal. This is something that has been brought up to do with Roe versus Wade, because Roe versus Wade didn't acknowledge a woman's right to control her body. It just acknowledged her right to not have the state interfere. But that's a negative right, not a positive right. Rights to privacy are a huge issue because privately, all men oppress all women. The more classic argument for porn, and the only argument really, is basically, well, socially liberal countries are more feminist and also more pro-porn, which just isn't really an argument. It's with this, therefore because of this. Con hoc ergo propter hoc. It's a fallacy again. Now, one other thing brought up is hentai. Basically, Grebowicz says that hentai tends to be pretty fucked up and feminists don't really talk about it. I think this might be because, as I've mentioned before, feminists who are pro-porn think the only reason you can be anti-porn is if you think porn physically hurts women. But hentai doesn't have real women in it. Yet, hentai often infantilizes women, which is bad. It also sexualizes the murder and torture and death of women, which isn't great. I mentioned hentai in the comments on my original video on kink shaming. Of course, it's not surprising that pro-porn feminists don't talk about hentai, because they never really talk about what porn is. They talk about porn as an idea and what it might mean conceivably, but they never talk about the actual porn that's made and watched. One final thing, it's mentioned how porn often plays off real-world tragedies like slavery and the Holocaust, and the example mentioned in this book is Arab prisoners being raped in Abu Ghraib prison. This also got me thinking about specific individuals who are attacked through depictions in porn, like Sarah Palin. For me, I just think this is disgusting, and I can't understand how anyone could ever defend undermining a woman by showing her in a porn film, when we all know that such a depiction would really bother her. I don't like Palin, obviously, but morally I really can't make portraying her in a film anything less than reprehensible. One last thing, Amy Allen is the final pro-porn feminist mentioned in this book, who makes this claim: the depiction of women as victims also threatens to undercut the very aim of feminism, the empowerment of women. This argument is a repurposed anti-feminist argument. A lot of liberal feminist arguments against radical feminism are just repurposed anti-feminist arguments. You're the misogynist if you believe in rape culture because you think women are victims. It's a woman's choice to decide to do the housework and earn less than her husband. Those arguments are terrible, right up until the point they're used against radical feminists, and then all of a sudden they're knockdown arguments. Anyway guys, I'm King Farazon, and thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. Obviously now I'm spending a lot of time on these videos, and for that reason I have a Patreon now. I don't expect huge amounts of money, but if you like the content I'm making, then consider donating. But perhaps more important than that, if you do like this, you should subscribe and do share and like. I'm sure plenty of people will disagree with me. You might want to get used to that. But if you have any responses to my position, then let me know in the comments below. And as always, don't take my word for it, check it out for yourself.